In the last video, we saw that Kripkenstein argues that there is no fact of the matter what any of our words mean. There is no such thing as meaning. Now, Kripkenstein points out that there are two ways to respond to his argument. First, there is what he calls a straight solution. A straight solution involves showing that the argument fails by pointing to some fact that constitutes meaning. So the straight solution would point to a fact which demonstrates that when I use the word plus, I mean the plus function rather than the cus function. We examined a number of straight solutions in the last video, and we saw that Kripkenstein rejects them all. Maybe there's some other straight solution that would be able to resist the skeptical argument, but it may be worth considering whether there might be a different way to approach the problem. So a different way, which is promoted by Kripkenstein, is what he calls the skeptical solution. The skeptical solution accepts the skeptic's argument, so it accepts that there are no facts about meaning. But then it goes on to argue that we can still legitimately talk about meanings, and we can still attribute meanings to ourselves and others. Ascribing meanings is a certain special kind of social practice, and this practice is perfectly justifiable, even though there aren't, strictly speaking, any meaning facts. So let's lay this out clearly. Let's suppose that we observe Frank performing various additions or whatever of numbers less than 57. Frank's behaviour is compatible with him using both plus and cus, and many other deviant functions. But we will probably say, well, Frank means plus. Now, what Kripkenstein says is that this statement is not true. There aren't actually any facts about what Frank means. There are no meanings. So when we say Frank means plus, that's not true. However, we can still be justified in asserting this sentence. We can still be justified in using this kind of sentence, because sentences like this can still play important roles in our society. And that's enough to justify their usage. Basically, the skeptical solution tells us to look at the circumstances under which we ascribe meanings to people. We consider the role that statements about meaning play in our language and our society. If we can show that there are circumstances in which such statements are useful, then that's good enough. That's good enough as a solution to the problem. We don't need these statements to be true. It's good enough for us to show that they are useful. That will justify our meaning, our discourse about meaning. And by comparison, we might consider the moral error theory. Moral error theory is a view in metaethics. It's the view that there are no moral facts, that all statements about morality are false. So slavery is wrong, giving to charity is good, murder is worse than theft, and so on. All such statements are just false according to the moral error theory, because nothing is morally wrong, nothing is morally good, nothing is morally worse or morally better than anything else. There simply are no moral values. I have a video on the moral error theory if you're interested in learning more about it. What's important to note for this video is that many defenders of the moral error theory have argued that just because there are no moral values, it doesn't follow that it's unreasonable to continue making moral statements. And this is because the concept of morality can still play important roles in our lives, in terms of regulating people's behaviour, for instance, or instilling in children a sense of care for others and maintaining social stability and so on. And furthermore, the kinds of moral judgments that a person makes can tell you a lot about whether or not you would want to be around that person. A person's moral judgments reveal something about their attitudes. When a person has moral views that diverge very much from your own, you often find that somewhat repugnant. If somebody was to come out saying that racism is morally good, is that the sort of person I want to be around? I might want to avoid that kind of person. I don't like their general attitudes. And of course, people's moral views also tell you something about how they might treat you in the future. If somebody thinks that theft is morally acceptable, well, you might say that I want to avoid being around such an unscrupulous person because they might steal from me. So the fact is, we have moral reactions, and these reactions are central to our lives. So there may well be good reason for saying, for instance, slavery is wrong or giving to charity is good, even though these statements aren't true. Kripkenstein wants to say a similar thing with respect to statements about meanings. He says that ascriptions of meaning are useful because they allow us to distinguish between people that we can and cannot trust in our everyday interactions. If we treat somebody as following the same rule for addition, if we treat somebody as meaning plus rather than cuss, then when presented with a problem about addition, we can expect we can expect everybody who's using the same rule, everybody who we assign the same meaning to agree in their responses, or at least come to agree in their responses after deliberation. If I ask people what is 68 plus 57, I expect that they will answer 125. And if they give a different answer, I can put this down to them making a mistake in their workings, which is easily rectified. So basically, I use a word correctly when I use it in agreement with the members of my community. Naively, right, we would say that people agree on the usage of a word because they mean the same thing by it. We would say that we expect everyone to answer 125 because everybody means the same thing when they use the word plus. But Kripkenstein's skeptical solution is that the agreement in usage is all there is. And when we talk about meanings, we're simply pointing to this phenomenon of agreement. It's not that you agree on the usage because you mean the same thing. It's just the agreement is all there is. To be clear, Kripkenstein does not require complete agreement. After all, people can make mistakes. I might say that 68 plus 57 is 135. You wouldn't thereby decide that I mean something different by the word plus. You'd instead say that I made a mistake in the calculation, and you'd try to show me where I went wrong. What's important is that were you to sit me down and work through the sum with me, we would eventually come to agree. And notice that if you could never get me to agree, if you tried in various ways to explain how I'm wrong, but I just reject everything and insist that 68 plus 57 is 135, well, in that case, you might well account for the disagreement by ascribing a different meaning to the words I use. You might just think I must be using the word plus in a different way. So to give a specific example of all of this, let's say that Frank is an accountant. Well, if I judge that Frank means plus rather than cuss, I can rely on him to help me with financial matters. On the other hand, if I think he means cuss or some other deviant function, I should probably look for a different accountant because he's not going to be very useful, right? Christopher Gorka says, and I quote, "When we take a person's words to have a certain meaning, we ascribe to that person an ability, and we rely on that ability in our interactions with that person." So one question that is obviously prompted by all this is, how exactly is this a skeptical solution? Why don't we just say that there are facts about meaning, but that these facts, but that meanings are determined by the responses of the community of which I'm a part? From what we've said so far, it looks like we could say that Frank does in fact mean plus and not cuss, but that this is determined by his place in the community as a whole. Now, Kripkenstein's response to this point is rather unclear, but Michael Morris, in his introduction to the philosophy of language, he interprets Kripkenstein as basically adding that there is no fact of the matter which community I belong to. So the argument is something like this: Frank means plus when he can be taken as using the word plus in agreement with the members of his community. But there is no fact of the matter what community Frank belongs to. So there is no fact of the matter whether Frank means plus or cuss or something else. So why should we think that there's no fact of the matter what community people are part of? Well, imagine that the world contains two communities, A and B, who also use the word plus in slightly different ways. Community A uses plus exactly as we do. Community B uses the word in a very similar way, except that 0 plus 0 is equal to infinity. For whatever reason, this is how B's mathematics has developed. Now, I also use the word plus, and my usage is very similar to both A's and B's. Of course, it doesn't perfectly match either. For one thing, because I I sometimes make mistakes. So, the answers that I give to addition problems are slightly divergent from each of these communities. But let's say that my usage is close enough to the ideal of both societies, so both A and B would count me as a competent user of the word plus. This is just to say that community A and community B would both count me as being a part of their linguistic community. Members of each community would say that I mean plus. Now, I'm asked the question 0 plus 0, and I answer 0. Community A would agree with this, community B would not. Remember, my use of plus is close enough to both A's and B's that both communities would count me as a member. Both communities would say that when I use the word plus, I mean plus as they understand it. So my answer is correct by A's lights and it's incorrect by B's lights. Now the question is, which community do I actually belong to? If I really belong to A, then my answer really is right. On the other hand, if I really belong to B, then my answer really is wrong. But Kripkenstein will say that the choice here is just arbitrary. My usage is close enough to A's and it's also close enough to B's, and that's all we can say about it. So there is no sense in which my answer really is right or wrong. All we can say is that it's right by A's lights, it's wrong by B's lights. But that's it. Now, the obvious objection to this is that community membership isn't determined by your use of one single word. If I'm a hermit, then I'm a member of neither community. If I'm living among the people in A, then I'm a member of A, similarly for B. But I think this is to misunderstand Kripkenstein's point. In this context, being a member of a community involves nothing more than using words in agreement with the members of that community. So even if you're a hermit or if you're a Robinson Crusoe alone on an island, if you use the word plus in a similar way to the rest of us, then we can count you as being part of the same linguistic community. We can apply the same criteria of meaning to you that we apply to everyone within our community. That's all that's involved. So community A can take me as being in agreement with their usage of plus, and community B can take me as being in agreement with their usage of plus. There isn't any fact of the matter whether my usage really is in agreement with A's or really is in agreement with B's. There's just nothing more to be said other than the judgments that each community might make. In that sense, it's arbitrary which community I belong to. So this is why we can't say that facts about meaning are determined by the community of which you're a part, because the community of which you're a part is just arbitrary. Morris actually points out that Kripkenstein's skepticism is arguably even more severe than it might seem from this, because if it's arbitrary what community a particular person belongs to, it looks like it's going to be arbitrary which individuals count as forming a community in the first place. In other words, it's going to be arbitrary whether or not a group of individuals are in fact a community, whether a group of individuals are in fact talking in agreement with one another. So it seems like we can draw the boundaries of a community wherever we like. Ultimately then, we end up with the conclusion that we are justified in saying that I mean plus, not cuss, because I talk in agreement with some arbitrarily defined community. Of course, it might also be in agreement with communities who adopt different rules. To some other arbitrarily defined community, I mean cuss and not plus. To the question 68 plus 57, there isn't any right answer. It depends entirely on what community you're counted as being a member of, and there is no fact of the matter about that. So that's an extremely radical skepticism, and that is basically the outlines of Kripke's skeptical solution. There are several problems with the skeptical solution. First of all, the skeptical solution tries to show that we don't need facts about meaning by appealing to agreement. But without meaning, how can agreement ever get off the ground? Consider the invention of a new rule. For any rule, there must be a point where some individual invented it. Perhaps addition, for instance, arose kind of naturally through evolution or whatever. But think about technical developments such as imaginary numbers. Rules for the use of imaginary numbers were first set down by Raphael Bombelli in the 1500s. At one point, Bombelli was the only person using the rules for imaginary numbers. With respect to imaginary numbers, there was no community for him to be in agreement or disagreement with. Of course, Bombelli was a member of a wider community with respect to the other words he used, but the point is that the community at the time did not use imaginary numbers, so there was no possibility of agreement in that respect. Now, maybe I'm incorrect about the history of the mathematics here, but you should be able to see the point of the example. It looks like, on Kripkenstein's view, there would be no way for anybody to ascribe any meaning to Bombelli's statements about imaginary numbers. Bombelli wasn't saying anything in agreement with the community because no community had any idea what imaginary numbers were. So it's very unclear on Kripkenstein's view how new meanings or new agreements can ever arise. Bombelli's contemporaries would have had to say that he was just talking nonsense, and presumably he would not have been able to get people to agree with nonsense. Of course, Kripkenstein in some respects can bite the bullet on this criticism. When Bombelli first set down the rules for the use of imaginary numbers, it would have been unjustified to ascribe any meaning to his words. Only when many people adopted a usage in agreement with his can we start to talk about meanings. I suppose there is something plausible about that idea. After all, if we imagine a mathematician coming up with some new type of number, but nobody anywhere takes him seriously and nobody adopts the idea, we might well be inclined to say that this mathematician's work was meaningless. We might. I'm not sure I would buy that, but it's a plausible, defensible view that ascriptions of meaning become justified only when you start converting other people to your usage. But this doesn't really answer the problem, though, because, the important question is, how did Bombelli persuade other people to adopt his usage? Again, Bombelli was the only one using the rules. In that case, he can only have been talking nonsense on Kripkenstein's view. How did Bombelli persuade other people to start agreeing with nonsense? So there's a bit of a problem there. A rather more serious problem has been noted by Paul Hoffman. Hoffman suggests that Kripkenstein actually underestimates the power of the skeptical problem. Kripkenstein thinks that the problem arises, that the problem is that there is no justification for responding one way or another to a question like, what is 68 plus 57? Because we don't know whether we're using plus or cus, or rather there is no fact of the matter whether we are using plus or cus, which means there's no fact of the matter whether we should respond with 125 or 5. But Hoffman thinks that Kripkenstein's skeptical argument actually shows that there is no such thing as responding one way or another to a question like this. What the skeptical argument shows is that there is no difference in responding between responding 125 and responding 5. So to lay this out, we first of all need the distinction between types and tokens. Consider the following words: vol, vol, vol. We say that there is one type of word here and 3 tokens of that type. The type is the sort of form of the word, the token is the particular instance. Let's take our problem 68 plus 57, and let's suppose that 2 people respond to this problem. They both say 125. So we have 2 token utterances of 125 in response to the problem. Now the question is, are these responses the same or different? Well, surely they're the same. But we have to be careful here. So let's spell this out a bit more precisely. Hoffman says that in order for 2 token utterances to be the same response to a question, those 2 token utterances must be tokens of the same type. I think the point is fairly trivial. The point here is just, look, there must be some type of word such that each token utterance of that word constitutes the same response. Take the word 125. I can say 125 and you can say 125, and we think that these two token utterances are of the same type. You know, the word that I'm saying is the same as the word, is the same type as the word that you are saying, and therefore they are the same response. Similarly, in order for two token utterances to be different responses to a question, the two token utterances must be tokens of different types. Again, this is fairly trivial. Suppose I utter 125 and you utter 5. We assume that these utterances are tokens of different types. So, it seems that if I ask 68 plus 57 and two people respond with 125, that looks like they are indeed giving the same response. After all, it seems that their two token utterances are tokens of the same type. But there's a bit of a snag in this picture, and this is that for some token word, we can't tell what type of word that token is merely from the form of the token word. First, because two words can have the same spelling, as in the word bank. Bank can be a token of the type expressing bank as in financial institution, or it can be a token of the type expressing bank as in riverbank. Second, the same word can have different spellings. Consider the British spelling of colour and the American spelling of colour. These are the same word. Those are just stylistic differences. The spelling is stylistic differences. When an American talks about colour, he's using the same word as the British person is. It's just a stylistic difference. It's like if you were to write a word in different fonts, or you were to write a word in both lowercase and capitals, or you were to speak a word in a slightly different accent or whatever. This is just the point that the same type of word can have different spellings, or it can be different in various ways. The token utterances can be different in various ways. Again, this is all quite obvious. But with all of this in mind, Hoffman thinks that the skeptical problem means that the conditions for sameness and difference cannot be met, because the skeptical problem shows that there is no fact of the matter what type a token is a token of. Let's take the word plus. There is no fact of the matter whether an utterance of plus is a token of the type addition or the type quaddition. This is the lesson of the arguments from the first video. When a person uses the word plus, there's no fact of the matter whether they mean addition or quaddition. The same sound, plus, or the same spelling, plus, can express different words, and the skeptical problem is that actually there is no fact of the matter what word it expresses. Furthermore, as we noted, these arguments generalise to all of meaning. So when a person says 125, there is no fact of the matter whether this is a token of the word 125 or the word 5. The skeptic would say, well, suppose that the person simply spells the word 5 somewhat differently from us. When that person says 125, they're actually expressing 5. They're actually in line with the cuss rule. Just like an American spells colour differently from the way I spell it. It's the same word, so that we can imagine that somebody has a very unusual spelling of the word 5. They spell it 125 rather than just 5. What Kripkenstein's argument really shows then is that there is no such thing as responding one way or another. When we ask two people what is 68 plus 57 and they both respond 125, those responses are not the same. And they're not different either. There is no fact of the matter either way. Now, obviously, if there's no such thing as responding one way or another, there can be no such thing as agreement in responses. And that means that Kripkenstein's skeptical solution completely falls apart. He tries to appeal to agreement within the community to justify ascriptions of meaning. But there is no such thing as agreement within the community. It just can't get off the ground. So that's, I think, a little bit more of a challenge. A third problem, according to the skeptical solution, statements about meaning express the fact that we expect people to give the same responses, or at least to come to agree on their responses after deliberation. For instance, we expect that when we ask what is 68 plus 57, we expect that everybody who means plus will answer 125, at least after appropriate deliberation. Now, the question is, what exactly does this expectation amount to? I mean, let's call this expectation the plus expectation. The expectation that those who mean plus will answer 125, that's the plus expectation. Abstracting them, we can say that the plus expectation is the expectation that when people are presented with the question x plus y, they will answer with the sum of x and y after appropriate deliberation. And the important thing to note about this is that since there are an infinite number of sums, you can't have an explicit expectation for every single one. Take, for example, what is 5,349 plus 8,399? The correct answer is 13,748. Presumably you've never thought of that before. You wouldn't have had the expectation that a person asked that particular question will answer 13,748 because you've just never thought of that sum before. You have no you don't know what the answer is yourself, so you don't have an expectation about what they will say. So what that means is we can now consider the cus expectation. This is the expectation that when asked what is x plus y, everybody who means plus will answer with the sum of x and y unless either number is over 57, in which case they will answer 5. I won't rehearse Kripkenstein's argument here. It's clear enough that this skeptical problem arises again in this case. I cannot know whether, or rather there is no fact of the matter, whether I expect people who mean plus to answer 125 or 5. So I can't say whether I have the plus expectation or the cus expectation. We can't know what our expectations are. This means that we can't suppose that our expectations agree with the expectations of others. Ascriptions of meaning are supposed to be justified by community agreement and by the expectation and by our expectations about how others will behave, but actually the skeptical problem undermines this. We don't have any expectations about how other people will behave if the skeptical problem goes through. Fourth, note that Kripkenstein takes meaning to involve ascribing an ability, and it's an ability that allows us to trust the other person in our interactions with them. I say that my accountant Frank means plus, not cus, so I expect him to be able to answer in a certain way when presented with certain questions. I expect him to be able to deal with finances reliably and so on. But when I ascribe to him ability, it seems like what I'm doing here is ascribing to him the same ability that I have. My expectation that Frank will answer questions and operate with numbers in the same kind of way that I would. I mean, perhaps I think that Frank is a bit more competent than me, but I'm ascribing the same ability, the same skills to him. He's just more well versed in them than I am. So I'm saying that Frank has the same ability to me. But in that case, I must have prior knowledge of my own abilities, and therefore prior knowledge of my own meaning. I mean, to put the point more simply, the criticism here is that the reason why I assume that other people are following plus and not cus is because plus is the meaning that I use. Plus is the rule that I follow. But that means I have knowledge of my own meaning. Remember, in Kripkenstein's solution, the community comes first, as it were. That there is no meaning. Ascriptions of meaning are just sort of a matter of community agreement. But it's actually not clear that this is really even coherent, because I only assume that other people are using a rule like plus rather than cus because plus is the rule that I use. So it's not clear that the community can come first. Finally, arguably the solution is not acceptable even on its own terms. Remember, the point of the skeptical solution is to show that although there are no meanings, we can get along fine without them. Kripkenstein focuses on the question of whether our ascriptions of meaning can be justified without meaning facts. Let's put aside the problems that we've noted and grant that his explanation works. Serious questions still remain, because ascriptions of meaning aren't simply used as a practical everyday tool for getting by in the world. Meaning has important consequences in other areas. For instance, meaning is connected to truth. If we say that a sentence has no meaning, then it looks like we're going to have to say that it's neither true nor false. So if we reject meanings, we reject truth values. How can a meaningless sentence be true? How can it be false? Meanings are also connected to mental states. We assume that our sort of thoughts are about propositions with meaning. So, I believe that it is raining. I hope that I live a long and healthy life. The content of these thoughts is determined by their meaning. It is raining and I have a long and healthy life are propositions with certain meanings, and my thoughts involve taking a certain attitude to these propositions. Belief in one case, hope in the other. So it looks like the rejection of meaning is not at all as easy as Kripkenstein seems to assume. In order to show that we can do without meanings, we also need to show that we can do without truth and we can do without postulating mental states, among probably many other things. Or we need to show that meaning is not connected to truth and to mental states and so on in the way that I've suggested. But I mean, either way, Kripkenstein has far more work left to do before the skeptical solution is anything even approaching a solution. So there are some severe problems with the skeptical solution. In various ways, the skeptical solution seems to fall prey to the very problem it was designed to solve. And even if Kripkenstein can solve that problem, it looks like doing away with meanings entails doing away with truth and mental states as well, and Kripkenstein doesn't even try to defend that. So I think we need to reconsider the straight solution, see if we can find a straight solution that works. That's what I'll do in the next video. But that's all for today. Thanks for watching.